Hi again, I'm Gene Edwards, and tonight we have two first-time authors. Later in our show, we're going to talk with Mississippi native Joe Lee about his new book, On the Record. It's a fun, fast-paced mystery, lots of local color. That's coming later. First, a conversation with Tayari Jones. Her debut novel, Leaving Atlanta, looks back at the Atlanta child murders of 1979. She was just 9 years old when the first body was discovered, and she lived through two terrifying years during which at least 20 more children were murdered. Two of them students at her elementary school. Told from the point of view of a fifth-grade girl, Leaving Atlanta is a powerful coming-of-age story which was set during one of the South's most dramatic and volatile periods. I'm glad you're here.
Well, thank you for having me.
And this is just terrific.
Thank you.
This is really, this is your first time out.
Yes, it is.
Lots of people holding your hand.
More than I have hands.
Yeah, and you just take a big leap and off you go. Tell me how it happened. Tell me how the story found you.
Well, when I was in college at Spelman College in Atlanta, I used to tutor an 8-year-old boy, and he didn't show up at the appointed time for tutoring. And I panicked. I was looking all over for him, and I asked my friends to help me look. And I noticed that some people immediately came to my aid, and others were doing their homework and said, oh, he'll show up. And he did show up. He was actually at Popeye's having an unauthorized snack. But I couldn't find him. And after it was all over, I realized that the people who had come to my aid were people who had been born and raised in Atlanta. And I started thinking that what was the experience that made us go and look for him? And I realized is that we had all lived through the child murders and that it lingered with us. And I became curious about how this affected the consciousness of a generation, how this affected our particular coming of age.
That whole section of Atlanta that lived through it, a lot of people believe that he's still on the loose.
A lot of people do. I think that the fact that they think it is even more interesting than the truth because it reflects the climate of a city and people's distrust of legal system and what they believe is plausible. Mm-hmm. I think in many cases, many times about this, that the phenomenon of it is almost as fascinating as the events themselves.
Did it steal your childhood?
You know, people often say that, and I never felt as though my childhood was stolen. I think it was altered because the thing about childhood is that it happens regardless.
Right.
Yes, there was a serial killer on the loose, but at the same time, we were still children. You know, we agonized over would we be invited to slumber parties and are we wearing the right clothes? Mm-hmm. We worried, will our parents divorce? But we also worried about this serial killer. And what I wanted to do in the novel was to look at the way that this is woven into our childhood and how it informed our childhood, but I don't think that it stole it.
You don't think so?
No.
But it adjusted it.
Indeed, it did.
It made you think about things that children just aren't supposed to think about.
Yes, well, we thought of it as well as children do. Adults were actually more frightened than the children, I think, because adults think more globally. As a kid, you have a thought like this. There's a serial killer on the loose, but we have a Cocker Spaniel. And our cousin, who is 12, is staying with us. We're safe. But parents know that someone could come in, get you, your cousin, and the Cocker Spaniel. Right. But as a kid, your thinking is so focused, and you are so superstitious and believe in talismans and mm-hmm. signs that you have a different kind of fear than adults imagine that you would.
But you know, you just don't know who to trust. There's this wonderful scene that you wrote in your book about your young heroine's father coming in early in the morning and waking her up to go outside and fix a gutter that's leaking. And you know, there's this terrifying moment when you think, well, what if it's him?
It's true, but if you keep in mind that section 2, it almost like it took all the fears that you may have had already. Like this kid is already kind of afraid of the father. And so it takes whatever fears or anxieties and magnifies it. So I felt like the experience was so specific to each particular child because of that particular child's demons become magnified. Because as children, you just can't get a good sense of it globally. And children also personalize things. So everyone was in their own personal, individual terror.
So she's afraid, and she writes her name down. Piece of paper. Puts it in her pocket.
Just to be safe, you know.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, talisman, charms, etc. of your kid, these things have such power.
Mm-hmm. So, how did you get it to here? How did you get it to here?
Well, I went to Arizona to study creative writing because by chance I met an author by the name of Jewel Parker Rhodes. I literally ran into her. She's not a very tall lady, and I am. And I was so embarrassed. Oh, my goodness, you know, what have I done to you? Are you okay? And it turned out that she had read the one story that I had published, and she said, move to Arizona and work with me. I'll be your mentor. And I said, oh, no, ma'am, I can't move to Arizona.
I'm from Atlanta.
It's really hot out there, and they don't have the King holiday. And she says, it's only hot in the summer, and we have the King holiday now. So I moved there for her to mentor me, and she and the other professors worked with me step by step. And when I was finished, she personally delivered it to her agent, who agreed to represent me.
Really?
Yes.
First time.
Yes, but I did move to Arizona. People say you didn't pay your dues, and I tell them they weren't in that broken down Corolla with me riding across the country.
Riding across the desert, looking for that. There are so many parallels here to what's going on now in our country. Of course, you were writing this a couple of years ago, so you didn't know about it.
I didn't know, and I have noticed that, but I also have noticed that in all the news coverage now about the recent spate of child abductions, there's been no mention of the Atlanta children.
Why do you suppose that is?
I don't know. I think it's complicated. I called in a radio show once to ask about this. They cut me off, by the way, but the lady said...
I'm not going to cut you off.
She said, that's more serial killing than child abduction. So I think in one way it's been categorized as serial killing. Mm-hmm. And I also think the children who were murdered in Atlanta were largely, not only were they black children, but they were largely poor children. And I do think that there's more romance, if you will, surrounded by the idea of a blonde, rich child being abducted, like just the horror of it, to have everything and not have anything.
And you have videotape of that blonde, middle class or rich child, and that looks so good.
And such a picture of the house. I always show a picture of the house, and the thought is, in this, idyllic space, terror lurks. And for the Atlanta children, it seemed just like a sadness upon sadness for many of them, and I don't think it has the same news appeal.
But you weren't a poor kid growing up. You had to write down to that level.
Well, I wasn't a poor kid growing up, but I had a very unusual elementary school experience. Where I went to elementary school was located in Atlanta. Near the housing projects are 4 universities that form the Atlanta University Center. My parents were professors there.
Right.
So we had a school where half the children's parents were professors, and the other half of the school, the children lived in housing projects. And it's kind of funny because in the 70s, everyone was doing all this racial integration of schools, and we had a class integration situation at our school. So and that's how I happened to know the 2 children who were abducted. And so I witnessed that, and I try to look at that class dynamic among children in my book.
Tell me about the children who were abducted.
Most of them were from single-parent homes. Almost all of them were boys, and many of them were kids who had to help support their families. For example, selling, say, car air fresheners or something in the mall parking lot when they disappeared. Many of them were not terribly well supervised because their mothers worked and she's only one person, and they were kind of on their own. And I think this made them vulnerable to abduction and needing help. Someone could have offered them help, and they were abducted.
But as a child, how do you remember them, and how do you remember learning that they were gone and learning eventually that they were dead?
There were 2 of them in my class. One was a very quiet boy by the name of Yusef Bell, whose mother became very instrumental in the Mothers Movement. His school was about 2 blocks from ours, but he would walk over to participate in the gifted class. And he was very quiet, and he was the first one that when I saw him on the news, I recognized him as someone I knew. I was like, that's that boy from our class. And because he was...
So your parents didn't tell you?
We watched the news. The news became such a ritual for Atlanta families. Every day you went to see the news to see what has happened. So you'd sit around your dinner table with TV, and we got a TV because of this. My mother never allowed television while we eat. She would say, this family is civilized. We don't watch TV while we eat. But this news became so important that we had a small black and white television on top of the refrigerator. You could look up and see it. And the news would come every day, and they would announce who else had been.
And you looked up and saw your friend.
I looked up and saw him, and it felt very close to home at that point. And the other child in my class was a much different kind of child. He was old to be in the 5th grade. I still don't know how old he was, but he was at least 13 or 14, and all of us felt that he was the biggest, meanest, scariest kid ever. He rode a motorcycle, and we just thought this was...
In the 5th grade?
Because he was older. We thought this was completely scandalous, and we felt terribly vulnerable to him. He only came to school a couple times a month. But when he disappeared, we felt like, oh no, if this child, the baddest of the bad, a kid who's almost a grown-up, could be killed, what about us, you know, regular kids, those of us who ride bikes?
Yeah.
And I think we felt, at least I know I felt really vulnerable and afraid at that time.
Parents help you through it?
Actually, they did. My parents are extraordinarily conscientious, have always been. But I also often say a silver lining to this child murders is that children became sort of celebrities. Everyone was thinking about children. There was programming for children, that Halloween, there were all kinds of carnivals and constructive activities for kids who never had anything to do after school.
Special events.
Yes, now had things to do. And we felt loved by strangers. Like everyone all over the country was thinking about us. And so that was a kind of interesting flip side that I don't think I would have predicted of that event. And parents were very helpful. And my father always said, you know, I'm here with you all, we're safe. And I felt that because many of the students in my school did not have their fathers at home, that I was somehow a little safer because I had a father.
Yeah. And he had a profession, and he was somebody and had some importance.
And he's a really tall guy. And I just felt that he was invincible.
Yeah. Wow. So where do you go next? Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you that.
Okay.
Did you go to the funerals?
My mother didn't. My mother did not allow it. She said funerals are not for children.
The wakes?
No, my mother, she just felt that was completely inappropriate.
Yeah. Your mother in the book goes to the funeral.
Yeah, the funeral actually that I based it on is that during these murders, right around that same time, a child from my class died of other causes. And I did go to that funeral. The whole class went. Mm-hmm. And I just remember that mother's grief and just the whole dynamic of it. And that is really the incident that stayed in my mind, that I based that funeral in the book. Because I really think that if someone loses a child, the details of it are just that, details.
You have a wonderful image in there of catching tears
well, thank you.
in hands. It's really something. Well, what happens with you next?
Well, I'm signed to do another book with my publisher, Warner Books, and they are just a magnificent publishing house. And I'm working on a new book. It's also set in Georgia. It's called Rites and Passages.
And it's about?
It's about, I'll be general, it's about some young women living in Atlanta, in the part of town that's being, actually the part of town where this book is set, but now it's being regentrified. And they are literacy workers. They're living on this part of town that's in mid-regentrification. So you have really rich people building up these antebellum houses, and then you have people who are drug addicts living next door, and you have our characters who are like literacy workers. I think of almost like urban missionaries living in this neighborhood, and that's where it is. And what it's about is still coming together.
Yeah. These are fascinating themes, and I'm so glad you're writing about them. What a treat to meet you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good luck.
Thank you.
The book is, again, Leaving Atlanta. Big recommendation.
Thank you.
Thanks.